Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the National Theological College and Graduate School, a school on whose board I serve as a board member and where I am a professor of Bible and Theology, no remuneration, because I want to be a part of what they're doing in training nationals for the work of the ministry in Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and East Africa. To learn more about how you can also assist this great work through your prayers and giving, visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Well, on today's program, we are beginning a three-part podcast series on all things Israel. We will discuss Israel's past, Israel's present, and Israel's future. We will discuss the atrocities committed against the Jewish people and the amazing intervention of God to protect His chosen people from extinction. We will discuss the establishment of the nation of Israel in 1948 and the events that led up to that. We'll discuss the interesting history of the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl. All of this we'll discuss in this podcast series and much more. And to have this discussion, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Christopher Katulka. Professor Katulka is on staff with the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, where he serves as the Assistant Director of North American Ministry. He's also the radio host for the Friends of Israel Today radio program, which is also released in a podcast format. He is a writer for Israel My Glory magazine. He leads Christian tours of the land of Israel and is a sought-out teacher and conference speaker. He is also an adjunct professor for the Word of Life Bible Institute, where I first met him and our friendship began. Professor Katulka has a Bachelor of Science from Cairn University, a Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, with an emphasis in Old Testament studies. Professor Katulka, welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Paul, thanks. Great to be with you.
It's been a busy week for you, hasn't it? Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've had a very busy week because here at the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, we're doing what's called our Look Up virtual conferences, where we study God's prophetic word, and it's an online conference for free for people to tune in from all around the world. And so I have to pull double duty. I teach a message, and then I also MC the event as well. So
thank you for fitting us in today, and we're recording equivalent of 3 podcasts. And where can they go to acquire that information, that series?
We're actually calling this Lookup Conference. It's called Unraveling the Mysteries of the Bible, and it's talking about the importance of prophecy in the Bible, why it matters to a Christian. And so if you're interested, you can go to lookup.foi.org, and there you can register for free. It's a fantastic event, and you can do it right from the comfort of your own home.
Very good. Well, I'm a big fan of FOI, Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, thankful for what you all are doing. And we've had a long partnership as I served with Word of Life and many years in Dallas Seminary. You're a Dallas Seminary graduate as well.
That's right.
Well, Chris, you've served many years with Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, and obviously the nation of Israel and the Jewish people are very important to you. You're a Gentile, but you love the Jewish people. Would you share a little bit about your story?
You know, it happened during high school, actually, I can say. I met my 2 best friends at youth group at Calvary Baptist Church in Bristol, Pennsylvania, Sam and John Herzl. I hung out with Sam and John all the time. We became best friends, and they would always invite me over their house. So when I was in high school, I kind of knew I wanted to do ministry. I knew God was calling me into ministry. I didn't know what that would look like, though. The Herzls always had me over, and they always invited me over for dinner, and I always had a chance to interact with Sam and John's dad, Steve Herzl. And Steve Herzl, he was kind of like a spiritual father to me. He always was kind. He always spoke truth from the scriptures into my life, and it was just a real amazing experience to be a part of that family. I was over there so much, my parents were like, maybe you should come home sometimes, sometimes. So for my freshman year, I knew I wanted to go to what was then called Philadelphia College of Bible. And he said, we have a program with Friends of Israel, because Steve Herzl worked with Friends of Israel. He said, it's called the Institute of Jewish Studies. If you go there, all the credits from IJS will just transfer over to PCB, and you'll be good to go. You'll get even more credits than you would for your first year. So I did that because my friend Sam was doing it, and I'll do it, and we'll have a great time. So anyway, I do it, and the Lord grabs my heart that year in the Institute of Jewish Studies, and I started seeing something. As a Christian, I couldn't believe that I never thought about the fact that Jesus was Jewish. And he grew up Jewish, and Jewish culture and the Jewish environment of the Holy Land of Israel during the first century. And you never take those things into consideration as a Christian. And the more and more I started studying it, the more and more I saw two things. One, I believe Christians can deepen their relationship with Jesus if they know who he is on a Jewish level and they understand the culture that he came into. And the second thing is that Jewish people, Jesus is a Jewish hero. He is the Jewish Messiah. And I believe it's a great thing for us to be able to share the truth of who Jesus is to our Jewish friends in the kindness and love that we possibly can when it comes to sharing our faith. And so those two things coupled together, and Friends of Israel just became a natural place for me to live out, I believe, the calling that God gave me.
First book in our Greek New Testament. The New Testament starts with Matthew 1:1. Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham, right?
That's right. You can't know who Jesus is unless you really understand who is Abraham, who is David. Why do these two big machers, as they would say in Yiddish, why do they matter? And why does it matter for this lineage of Jesus? So yeah, 100%, all of that.
Well, Professor Katulka is also the author of a recently released book entitled Israel Always. It's published by Harvest House, and the contents of this book will be the focus of the rest of our conversation. Chris, what led you to write this book?
I wish I could say it was that, I was able to convince Harvest House to write it. It's actually the other way around. Harvest House was kind enough to ask me to write a book that they really thought was important for Christians to read. They wanted a resource for people who, number one, either want to go to the Holy Land, want to go to Israel, or maybe coming back from Israel, and they'd learned so much that they want to kind of recap and see the different layers and strata of Israel's history from Abraham to today. And even as we think about the future prophetically as well. So that's one component of it. The other component is to show the continuity of God's plan for Israel and the Jewish people. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more later. But Harvest House was kind enough to reach out to me and invite me into this process. That's really where the impetus was for me to write this book, was to help fulfill the vision that Harvest House had. Harvest House really values Israel and the Jewish people. We have a great relationship with them at Friends of Israel as well. And so it's an honor to be able to write for Harvest House.
Well, Chris, your book is divided into 3 sections. The first focuses on Israel's past. Some of that history is, of course, recorded in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. The second section focuses on Israel's present. And the third section focuses on Israel's future. It's very logical and understandable why you did it that way.
That's right.
In today's episode, I would like for us to discuss Israel's past. Now, because I also have a great love for the Jewish people, and I believe, as does Dallas Theological Seminary, NTCGS, Word of Life Bible Institute, and other like-minded schools and organizations, God has a plan and purpose for the nation of Israel. And we discuss this subject a lot on this program about the biblical history of the Jewish people. So I believe we do have a well-informed listening audience as it relates to that, the biblical history of the people. So we'll spend more time on the history of the Jewish people not contained in the scriptures. But having said that, we do need to summarize. Right? Please summarize for us. Provide us a brief survey of some of the key events recorded in the Bible regarding the history of people so that we can take that and build upon that for the extra biblical sources.
I would say, and in the book, I try to make this the foundation of the book in chapter 1. And really, to me, the foundation of the story of the Jewish people is a promise that God made to Abraham. That promise goes back to Genesis chapter 12, and you can almost read Genesis 1 through 11 and feel how God is leading history to this individual, Abraham, to bring redemption to the world, to be the one that God would use to start a family and to choose a land and to give a blessing to, in order to bring salvation to all the world, because that's what that promise says. A lot of times I think people interpret the promise that God made to Abraham and the chosenness of the Jewish people, we call them God's chosen people, as kind of almost like this exclusive club, Oh, excuse me, you're the God's chosen people. Excuse me, where's that country club? How do I get in there? That's I think what happens when you think about that. But really, you always have to ask yourself what you're being chosen to do. And I always tell people, when I pick one of my 4 kids and say, I'm choosing you to take the garbage out today, they don't go, oh, thank you, Dad. Thank you so much. No, they go, no, it's his turn or his turn. There is this tension in the Old Testament that is very, very real, that God chose the family of Abraham to bring the hope of redemption to the whole world. That's what it says. Through you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. He gave him a land. He gave him descendants. You know, there's that tension throughout the scriptures that go back and forth in Israel's biblical history of wanting to be chosen and ultimately leaving, how can I put this, finding their bobbing and weaving through God's plan, trying to stay in line with God, but then veering off and losing faith and following idols like the rest of the world. God chose them to be different in the world, and yet they would oftentimes assimilate into the world. And that's the tension of being chosen and being selected and set aside. We might even call that word being made holy, you know, being chosen by God. That is really, to me, in a short synopsis, you know, what it means to be God's chosen people. It always roots back to this individual Abraham. Every promise that God's going to make to Abraham and his family throughout the Old Testament is predicated on this one covenant that he will make with him in Genesis chapter 12, and again in Genesis chapter 15, again in Genesis chapter 17. There's reiterations of this unconditional promise. God cannot undo the promise he made to Abraham. It's eternal. And so that's why even when the Israelites were veering off and literally becoming like the rest of the world, God said, you don't deserve this. You don't deserve my grace. You don't deserve my compassion, but I cannot undo this promise, this covenant that I made with you. And for that reason, as you go throughout the history of the Jewish people or the Israelites in the Old Testament, what you find is all of it roots back to the promise that God made to Abraham. Why did God choose Moses? If you ever look, Moses appears on the scene after a very important verse, and that is in Exodus chapter 2 at the very end of the chapter. It says that God heard the groanings of his people as they've been in the land of Egypt, away from the land that God promised them. The nation has grown, and he says God heard the groanings of his people, and he remembered the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so then all of a sudden Moses appears out of nowhere. Moses came as a response to the fact that God was going to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham. And you can see that all throughout the scriptures. Why do the prophets come? The prophets come to remind the Jewish people that they are in a covenantal relationship with God and they need to obey the law. What are the kings there to do? The kings are there to set up the kingdom, that when God chooses a king, to set up a kingdom that would root back to the promise that God made to Abraham, to bring blessing to all the families of the earth. So why does Abraham matter? Why does David matter in this story? It's because it all goes back to a promise, an unconditional promise God made to the Jewish people that can't be broken. Part of that is going to set up the entire book. Chapter 1 sets up the entire book for not only as we talk about Israel past, but also Israel present and Israel future as well.
I love Eugene Merrill says that family went down to Egypt, but a nation came out.
Yeah.
You know, Satan wanting to thwart the efforts of God, and God will fulfill. It's not about if, but when. So as we walk through history, Satan's tried to annihilate them on many occasions. God remains faithful.
Yeah, you're going to see that throughout the book as well, is that tension where Satan wants to destroy what God values, because God values Israel and the Jewish people for the purpose that he's given them.
Well, in your chapter on the Promised Land and the Temple, you referenced a colorful drawing known as, can you give me the name for that? Pronounce it for me.
I've always called it the Bunting Clover Map.
Okay, the Bunting.
It could be Bunting, but Bunting for us English speakers.
Okay, so the Bunting Clover Leaf Map, named after the creator of the map, who's German theologian, so Heinrich Bunting, maybe we would use the more German pronunciation. This map can be seen in the land of Israel and is all over the internet. I actually regularly use this picture in my classes to show the prominence of Israel. Please explain this map further and how it's helpful in understanding prominent location of Israel as it relates to 3 continents.
Well, it shows, number one, is from a theologian's perspective from that time period, that the understanding of the importance of why God chose the land of Israel. You know, God didn't just say, Abraham, I'm going to choose you and your descendants. He actually said, I'm giving you a land. That's a part of the promise. And so that land, I think a lot of times people just think God spun the globe and, where are we going to stick this guy? All right here. That's not what God didn't haphazardly choose the land of Israel. And this map shows the reason why. It's because Israel is a land bridge, and the cloverleaf map that's there, as the leaves come out, they show the different continents that surround Israel. So you have the European continent, you have Asia, and then you have Africa below that. And so what you see is that Israel is a strategic location that God chose for Abraham. Remember, if his purpose is to be a people who would bring blessings to all the families of the earth, well, how are they going to do that? God's going to do that by placing them in the center of the nations. Ezekiel 5:5 even says that too. It says that God chose Jerusalem because it's the center of the nations. The nations came to Israel. So that's what the map shows, is the strategic place. There's a professor I used to have named Doug Bookman, and you might know Doug Bookman. Yeah. He is a fantastic teacher. You'll go in to learn 1 Corinthians, you'll come out learning the whole Bible somehow. So he's just a fantastic teacher. But I remember him calling it providential placement, that God providentially placed Abraham and his family in the land of Israel because all the nations were streaming through. If you wanted to bring your goods from Africa, from Egypt up into Persia, in modern day Iran, you had to go through Israel. If you wanted to bring goods from Ethiopia into Europe, you had to go through Israel. Everybody was streaming through Israel. It was the center of the world. It was one highway that ran up and down. And I talk about that highway a bit in the book. It's an international highway, and it really narrowed at a very strategic place in Israel's geography called Megiddo. It's called Tel Megiddo now. God specifically chose that place not for the economic benefits for the Jewish people, because the whole world streamed through there. Actually, it was the spiritual benefits, the economy of God wanting to make sure that when the Gentile world was streaming through Israel, they left hearing about Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Jewish people, if they were obeying the law, would look different from the rest of the world. And if that Gentile left Israel, they would go, something's going on down there. Have you heard about this God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That was why God chose them. In fact, God rarely ever sent missionaries, if you will, or prophets out into the world. The world was designed to come to them.
Very true. And again, that picture is just so vivid and so clear that this is the center of the world. And of course, in the coming kingdom, Jerusalem, Jesus Christ will rule from the throne of David for 1,000 years, and it will go into all of eternity. But right there in the center of the world, again, the focus of the world will be there in Israel. And so that's incredible. One other thing I was thinking about is I'm thinking of Daniel and the Seleucid and Ptolemies, right? As it talks about this intertestamental period, but Daniel prophesies about it and speaks about it. And Israel's kind of a ping pong ball between these two empires, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, because they're right there in the middle of where these two continents meet. And so especially prior to warplanes, huge navies, you had to go through the land to conquer the world.
It was always huge pressure for the Jewish people. Sometimes I think we can be mad at them for disobeying God, which I understand that you read the scriptures and you go, come on, guys, if you would have just obeyed, But at the same time, God put them in the center of the world, and the whole world wanted that piece of land too. Yeah. They wanted that land. It was so strategic, Paul, because it controlled, there are scholars that say if you controlled Israel, you controlled world trade. And so the world was constantly flooding in. And there's that issue again that pops up over and over again. It wasn't just in the Old Testament. It appears big time in between the Testaments. And that's the issue of assimilation. How much do we as Jewish people interact and become like the world? That becomes a very, very difficult concept that the Jewish people have to deal with, especially as Hellenization, takes over the world. And as the Romans come in, there's money, there's power, there's influence. And so there's always that tension that's going to be there as Israel is the center of the world.
So this land mass has been very strategic in wars, many wars, as you mentioned, Megiddo there, Armageddon, War of Armageddon in the future as well. A great war will take place in this location because it's so strategic.
Yeah, I mean, they fought for that land going back to the Canaanites. And I think the last battle that was fought there was World War I.
Right.
And then we also know, like you're saying, Megiddo, Tel Megiddo, or in Revelation, it kind of matches together Har, which means hill or mountain, and Megiddo, and they mess up the Hebrew and they make it Armageddon. Well, we know there's a future battle that will take place there as well. So yeah, there's that concept that appears over and over again is the strategic placement that God put Abraham in. Wasn't just happenstance. It was providential.
Well, we are discussing Professor Katulka's book, Israel Always, subtitled Experiencing God's Steadfast Purpose for Everyone Through His Chosen People. And in chapter 4 of your book, Israel Always, you write about the Intertest Minnow period, the approximately 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. A lot of very important events relating to the Jewish people and the history of Jewish people occurred during this time. The nation of Israel was on the verge of extinction multiple times, but God intervened, and one such intervention is celebrated on Hanukkah. Please explain.
There is the issue, like we were just talking about, of assimilation for the Jewish people. How different should we look from the world? Well, God tells them to look very different. I wish that we had more time. There could be a whole podcast dedicated to the book of Deuteronomy and the covenant of blessing, the land covenant of blessing and cursing. That if the Israelites would have just followed God's law, he would have blessed them and pushed the enemies away, and they would have been a blessing to the world. And then the other side of the coin is if you don't follow my law, I'm going to make you a curse, and you're going to end up being taken over by empires and things of that nature. That becomes very important to how God works throughout the history of Israel and the Jewish people. And we see this here even in between the testaments. By the time a man named Antiochus IV, king of the Seleucid Empire, which is just a Greek empire, but in Syria. It's a Syrian Greek empire. And so Antiochus IV is dealing with two big issues. Number one, Jerusalem has already been under fire a bit because of tensions between this high priest named Jason and Menelaus. So he's got tension there. Jason wants to ultimately take control of the high priesthood again. He was kicked out, and that high priesthood was bought by Antiochus and his father. And so there's that tension that takes place. And then also Antiochus wants to go down and defeat the Ptolemies, and he wants to take all of Egypt and show his power and influence. And so he goes down there to fight them around 167 BC in the Sixth Syrian War, they call it. And he goes down there. He's about to take over. I believe he'd even claimed himself as the ruler of that area. And then all of a sudden it says in the book of Daniel and other writings as well that the ships of Kittim show up and tell Antiochus, go back home. Go home. You can't take over. The ships of Kittim were Rome. Yeah. So Rome's influence is moving into the Middle East now. It's moving into Egypt, Syria, and Israel. Antiochus goes home.
So
and there's
you think
actually
Rome is saying, if you don't go back, we're going to join Egypt's efforts to attack you.
I do, but I also think that they were bringing a balance of power to the Middle East. And it wasn't just that we're siding with Ptolemy, because the Seleucids actually owed them a lot of money for previous war efforts and whatnot. So it's kind of like, hey, you need to go home and you got to focus on what you need to focus on. Don't worry about this. But actually, Antiochus, a lot of people say Antiochus probably left very angry going back home through Jerusalem, and he was angry. But really, a lot of scholars are arguing, no, actually, he didn't technically lose. He was trying to show, I have control over Israel. I have control over this area. And the Romans basically said, yes, you do. That's what they were. So he goes home. He's like, oh, at least they know I have control over this area. And that's where he begins to go back up into Jerusalem to really usurp and show his control over the people, to bring them under his influence, to reconquer them, essentially. And so he goes into Jerusalem after the Romans kick him out of Egypt. And as he's going back through Jerusalem, essentially Antiochus tells the Jewish people, you need to stop being Jewish and you need to be Greek like me. There's a certain people, as it says in the book of Esther, and these certain people are the Jewish people. They're different from us. They follow different laws. They do different things. Well, Antiochus was tired of this. He wanted everybody under his control. He wanted to reconquer Jerusalem and take it for himself and make sure that the people followed his rules. So he had said no more Torah reading, no more circumcision, no more synagogues, no more Sabbath services, no more identifying yourself, kosher keeping. Anything that identifies you as Jewish, you must stop. So he actually slaughters a pig in the temple. He sets up false gods in the Jewish temple, which commits what's called the abomination of desolation. And then he goes around and he makes leaders and Jewish people all around Jerusalem and in the area of Judea. He makes them slaughter a pig in honor of him. And in doing so, show allegiance to him. So you're committing an unkosher act, an unclean act as a Jewish person, which would basically rob you of your Jewish identity. And the Jewish people were doing this until one Jewish man named Mattathias stood up and he said, basically, over my dead body, my family will obey the laws of God. We will not slaughter a pig. And Mattathias that day kills a Jewish person who was slaughtering a pig and then kills the Greeks who were making them do it. And then him and a band of people, his children and other Jewish people, flee for the hills. And from that begin the effort to push the Greeks out of Judea, and they win. That's the big thing. They win. They rededicate the temple to the Lord, and that is where we get the account, the story of Hanukkah. But it became an issue, Paul, again, of assimilation. The Jewish people were assimilating. There's a great saying we always like to say here at Friends of Israel: there would be no Christmas without Hanukkah, because the Jewish people were on the brink of assimilating into Greek culture. And yet Mattathias, one Jewish man, stood up and said, no, I'm not going to let this happen. And they were able to push back the Greeks, a sign of God's deliverance of the Jewish people at that time.
You've summarized it and synthesized it very well, but there's a lot in there, isn't there, as far as Hanukkah?
I'm scratching the surface. Yeah. Paul, in John chapter 10, Jesus celebrates Hanukkah. And you can't overlook that, because they celebrate Hanukkah not just because they rededicated the temple to God. It's Independence Day. Hanukkah is Independence Day for Jewish people because they celebrate the independence of their identity, of who they are, who God called them to be. So it's a very important holiday.
Excellent. And I appreciate your point that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. Would you call it it's hard to call it modern, but it's the most recent holiday, Jewish calendar, as far as most of the ones instituted by God, Moses, as far as the various feasts. Hanukkah was a result of remembering that God was faithful to them, the verge of extinction or assimilation.
Yes, and it's become, even for modern Jewish people, it's still a very important holiday. But it's big because Jesus celebrated it. And that means that Jesus saw the need for the Jewish people being independent, that they would be their own people that God called them to be. He didn't ignore that. He actually embraced it. The Lord uses Daniel in an amazing way to give the Jewish people a picture of a near future prophecy, but then also a far-reaching prophecy. But it's almost seamless for how that would take place as he's describing this abomination of desolation, a picture of Antiochus Epiphanes, but then also a future abomination of desolation that Jesus talks about after the event, recasting the vision of Daniel into the future as well for a future Antichrist.
Well, another very important date in the history of the Jewish people and that of the nation of Israel is, of course, AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Please explain the events that led up to the destruction and the consequences of this.
Again, it's the same issue that the Jewish people had with Antiochus and the Seleucids. Now it's the Romans in charge, and there were tensions that were taking place about the Jewish people and their desire for independence, for freedom, and the amount of pressure that they would put on Rome in order to say, we want this freedom. There would be revolts that would take place. Rome was always constantly oppressing them, and the Jewish people, instead of just embracing it and assimilating, were pushing back as well. That's the big thing, is especially after the death of Herod the Great, his son Archelaus, who took over Judea, he just failed miserably. He was only there for a few years. And that's when Rome sets up basically a governorship in Judea and says, well, if we're not going to have Herod's sons control this, then we're going to put one of our own people in there, put one of our governors in there. So now all of a sudden you have a Gentile ruling over the land. You have to imagine what that does to a Jewish person. Herod has already did a great job of bringing Rome to Israel. Now Rome is really pushing its influence into the Holy Land. And so that's always going to create a rub. The more that those governors would push the Jewish people, instigate them, the more the Jewish people would respond. You can see the difference, especially when you get to someone like Pontius Pilate. If you notice, Pontius Pilate didn't push. Pontius Pilate didn't want to revolt. Instead of going, this guy, Jesus, is an innocent guy. According to Roman law, I can do nothing. Let him go. No, what does he do? He puts Jesus on the cross and he embraces what the Jewish people want because he doesn't want to deal with a revolt. Well, there were other prefects, other governors that were from Rome that thought totally differently. They wanted to push. They wanted to push the buttons of the Jewish people. By 67 AD, there were riots breaking out. The governors of Judea from Rome were pushing the buttons of the Jewish people enough to create actual riots that were going on in places like Caesarea, in places like Jerusalem, to the point where it created a firestorm, and the Roman Empire had to respond by sending in the armies to suppress the revolt completely. This will lead to probably about a 6-year war for Rome, sending a ton of energy, resources, military, all into this tiny backwater town of the Roman Empire to suppress these Jewish people. They wanted to stamp them all out. It starts in the north, up in the Galilee region. That's actually one of our very first interactions. The man that we've come to know is one of the historians of the Jewish people. His name's Josephus. He was actually fighting against the Romans, but would eventually become a Roman citizen himself under the family of Flavius Titus's family and Vespasian. And he would write the histories of the Jewish people. But then as the Romans keep pushing down, they come into Jerusalem by 70 AD. They destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They completely annihilate it, just as Jesus predicted. And then they don't stop there. You would think, okay, we're done. Let's move on. But they don't. They send them down. Vespasian, the emperor at that time, sends his troops down to chase every last zealot, every last Jewish person that fought against Rome until they were all stamped out. And that's where we get the story of Masada, when Masada falls in 73 AD. So again, it's a prediction of Jesus fulfilled. The temple is leveled, but it also sends out shockwaves in the Roman world. The environment of Israel is changing now, and it's going to become more and more Gentile.
For those that have been to the Colosseum, been to Rome, just yards from the Colosseum is the Arch of Titus, right? And that's, you think of this event as you're talking about it, Nero commits suicide, right? And Vespasian goes back to Rome to take over the empire and sends his son Titus to finish what he started, and that destroys the city. And that arch is found next to the Colosseum and has pictures of the menorah, the vessels taken from the temple, honoring what we see as atrocity.
They wanted control of that area, and so the Jewish people were the ones to suffer for it.
In chapter 6 of your book, Israel Always, you discuss the diaspora of the Jews, the scattering of the Jews around the world. Please help our listeners get a real sense of this scattering. We in no way are exaggerating. We say Jewish people were scattered the entire world.
Yeah, God says, if you don't follow me, curses will come. And he ultimately says, I'll scatter you where you'll find no rest to your feet. You know, you will wander around the world. And that's exactly what we see happening with Jewish people. Eventually, there's a second Jewish revolt that takes place under Rome. You have the first one, 70 AD. This last one's around 135 AD, when they completely kick the Jewish people out. They're not allowed back into Jerusalem. And they begin the process of going into communities of where Jewish people were already living, like Rome, and then from there into other areas of the world. So I took this chapter and I decided to break it down into 4 sections, which are basically the 4 different groups of Jewish people that come as a result of the diaspora. And the first one are the Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews are Jewish people who left after being kicked out of Jerusalem, and they settle in what's essentially Germany. And they're there for several hundred years. And there are times of great freedom for them, and then there were times of great oppression as well. But it's in this area, as they're in Germany, building a Jewish culture, that Ashkenazi Jewish people, they develop their own language called Yiddish. Maybe you've heard of Yiddish. It's where we get the words oy vey, or there's a lot of tsuris, which means trouble. It's where we get foods like bagels from, lox and bagels, matzo ball soup. And so there's this culture that is built as Jewish people are living in the diaspora. Klezmer music, if you just think of that classic Jewish music with the fiddle and with the clarinet, all of that is a part of the Ashkenazi culture. But eventually they migrate again because the pressure, the persecution of the Jewish people becomes so difficult in that area of Germany that they flee for Eastern Europe, which is eventually Poland becomes one of the largest hubs of Jewish people. They migrate to Poland, and it becomes one of the largest hubs of Jewish people around the world. And in fact, many of those Jewish people, the people that suffered the most during the Holocaust, were Ashkenazi Jews, Jewish people of Eastern European descent. But it always roots back to the Holy Land. It roots back to Israel in their DNA, but they consider themselves Ashkenazi. Another group is the Sephardic Jewish group, and they are from Spain. Jewish people were living as far out as Spain, so when they got kicked out of the land by 135 completely, they migrate to Spain. And we have some of our greatest Jewish rabbis, theologians writing, one named Rambam or Maimonides. He is a very famous 12th century AD rabbi who came up with the 13 principles, which is basically a Jewish doctrinal statement on what it means to be Jewish doctrinally, biblically. And so that's very important. He's world renowned even to this very day. But persecution again for the Sephardic Jews. They had their own language too, Paul. They had Ladino, which was a mixture of Hebrew and Spanish, where Yiddish is a mixture of German and Hebrew and Slavic languages as well. So they create their own languages, their own food. Persecution, though, pushes the Jewish people out of Spain and into areas of northern Africa and as far as the Middle East. And so but you can still see a presence of Sephardic Jewish people today. Finally, the last one are Mizrahi Jews, which are Jewish people who immigrated into the Middle East, into Iran, Iraq, and other areas of Yemen, Saudi Arabia. They immigrated into those areas. They became what was called, which is probably a more modern term, Mizrahi, which means east. They went east. And so they migrate to that area, and they built communities that have been there for thousands of years. Mizrahi Jews go back to even the Babylonian period when they were kicked out of the land under Nebuchadnezzar. But then I'll end with this one, Paul, is the last group is called the people of the land. You know, the thing that's important to know about Israel is that, yes, they might have been kicked out for a moment, but they always came back. There's always been a presence of Jewish people in the land the entire time as the diaspora was taking place.
Our time is up for today's podcast, so we'll have to leave the rest of our conversation on the history of Israel to our next episode. If you've enjoyed our discussion, you'll want to acquire your own copy of Professor Katulka's book, Israel Always. You can buy it at Amazon.com or HarvestHousePublishers.com. Also, please consider sharing this podcast and this episode with those in your spheres of influence, those who would benefit from this program. Also, please consider subscribing to this podcast and leave us a positive review. I hope that you'll join us again next week. In next week's podcast, we will continue our discussion with Chris about the history of the nation of Israel. You will not want to miss it. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters because what you believe determines how you behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.